Heidelberg, October 28, 1945. Dear Hannah Arendt, often over the past years we worried about your fate, and for a long time now we did not have much hope that you were still alive. It seems to me that you have completely maintained your inner core, whether you have been in Königsberg, Heidelberg, Paris, or America. Anyone who is a real human being has to be able to do that. Here, we now have to see what we can rebuild out of the chaos. Yours, Karl Jaspers.
New York, 1945. Dear, dear Karl Jaspers, my teacher. Ever since I've known that you both came through the whole hellish mess unharmed, I've felt somewhat more at home in the world again. I don't need to tell you that I worried about you all those years. My happiness in feeling a bond with you is mixed up with a childlike desire not to disappoint you. You are quite simply the greatest educator of all time. And don't laugh, it's true, and only because you are a philosopher. I've been turning your manuscript guilt question over and over again in my mind. Your definition of Nazi policy as a crime strikes me as questionable. The Nazi crimes, it seems to me, explode the limits of the law, and that is precisely what constitutes their monstrousness. We're simply not equipped to deal on a human and political level with a guilt that is beyond crime and an innocence that is beyond goodness or virtue.
Dear Hannah Arendt, I'm not altogether comfortable with your view, because a guilt that goes beyond all criminal guilt inevitably takes on a streak of greatness, of satanic greatness. This, for me, is as inappropriate for the Nazis as all the talks about the demonic element in Hitler. It seems to me that we have to see these things in their total banality, in their prosaic triviality, because that's what truly characterizes them. Bacteria can cause epidemics that wipe out nations, but it remains merely bacteria.
My beloved, adored teacher, I realize completely that in the way I have expressed this up to now, I come dangerously close to that satanic greatness that I, like you, totally reject. Perhaps what is behind it all is not only that individual human beings kill other individual human beings, but that an organized attempt was made to eradicate the concept of the human being.
I think that the most profound experience in Arendt's life was reading the horrors of what happened in the Holocaust. And I think that it is that reflection of the horrors of the Holocaust that is a key to a deeper understanding of everything she wrote after that, you know, including on revolution, the human condition, between past and future, the life of the mind.
When people talk, oh, her love of the world and so forth, it's a very real thing. But for the difference in the world, the difference is the plurality. That's another very basic concept of Arendt, is the plurality, the difference, the diversity. She thought, actually, that every single individual was unique. Every person in the world was unique. But more, I don't know if she was right, I think she was unique. I'm not so sure about everybody.
אם חנה ארנדט מאופיינת בתור אינטלקטואלית, זה כמישהי ששוברת קלישאות. יכול מאוד להיות שהיא בעצמה יצרה קלישאות חדשות, כי אנשים משתמשים במילים כמו הבנאליות של הרוע כקלישאה, ולא כמשהו עמוק וכו'. אבל זה הסכנה של אינטלקטואל שמשפיע הרבה.
בירושלים נעשות הכנות קדחתניות לקראת משפטו של אייכמן. כל באי המשפט יעברו דרך תאי זיהוי. הצורר ישהה בזמן מהלך המשפט בתא עשוי זכוכית משוריינת כדי למנוע כל אפשרות של התנגשות בחייו.
March 1961. My beloved, adored teacher. The Eichmann trial, against which you voiced your reservations at the outset, has now happily or unhappily thrown our plans out the window. But my dear and honored friend, I would never forgive myself if I didn't go and see with my own eyes this real-life disaster unfolding with all its uncanny vacuousness. Don't forget how early I left Germany and how little of this I really experienced directly. Many years ago, I described the totalitarian system. It was always the system rather than the individuals that I was referring to. And if you look at the system as a whole, every individual person indeed becomes a cog, small or big, in the machine of terror. Now I wanted to know who Eichmann is, insofar as he was a free agent who had the freedom of choice. And for this reason, the whole small cog theory is irrelevant. This probably was my most powerful motive to go to Jerusalem.
אין ספק שהיא נכנסה לפה עם רעיונות שמאיימים מאוד על המיתוסים הלאומיים. זאת אומרת, יש לה מחשבה אנטי-מיתולוגית, אנטי-אידיאולוגית, אין יותר מדי גיבורים, ואני מבין שאולי בהתחלת בניית האומה קשה מאוד לספוג את המחשבה שלה.
Clearly, this courtroom is not a bad place for the show trial that David Ben-Gurion, Prime Minister of Israel, had in mind. Not once has he attended a session. In the courtroom, he speaks with the voice of Gideon Hausner, the Attorney General.
ספר דברי הימים של עם ישראל רווי סבל ודמעות. הציווי בדמייך חיי מלווה ומעזור מאז הופעתה על במת ההיסטוריה. כבר פרעה במצרים החליט לענותם בסבלותם להשליך בניהם ליאור. המן ציווה להוגדם, להורגם.
It was bad history and cheap rhetoric. It was not an individual on the stand at that historic trial, and not even the Nazi regime itself, but anti-Semitism throughout history. Even worse, it suggested that perhaps Eichmann was only an innocent executor of some mysteriously predetermined destiny, or for that matter, even anti-Semitism itself.
אך בכל הנתיב העקוב מדם של עם זה מאז היותו לגוי ועד היום לא קם אדם אשר עלה בידו לעולל את אשר עולל משטר הרשע של היטלר ואת אשר ביצע אדולף אייכמן.
In the eyes of the Jews, the catastrophe that had befallen them under Hitler, in which a third of their people perished, appeared not as the most unprecedented crime of genocide, but as the oldest crime they knew and remembered. None of the participants at the trial ever arrived at a clear understanding of the actual horrors of Auschwitz, because it appeared to the prosecution and judges alike as not much more than the most horrible pogrom in Jewish history. What they missed is that the supreme crime that they were confronted with was a crime against humanity, perpetrated upon the body of the Jewish people, and that only the choice of victims, not the nature of the crime, could be derived from the long history of anti-Semitism. Genocide is an attack upon human diversity as such, without which the very words mankind or humanity would be devoid of meaning.
In diesem Herbst, Frau Arendt, ist in der Bundesrepublik Ihr Buch über den Eichmann-Prozess in Jerusalem erschienen. Und diese Arbeit ist seit ihrem Erscheinen in Amerika sehr, sehr heftig diskutiert worden. Und besonders von jüdischer Seite richten sich ein Teil der Vorwürfe, die man ihnen gemacht hat, auf am Ton, in dem manches geschrieben ist.
Wenn man der Meinung ist, dass man über diese Dinge nur schreiben kann, wie soll ich sagen, pathetisch. Und indem man, wenn, oder sagen wir mal anders, ich will gar nicht aggressiv werden.
Werden Sie aggressiv?
Nein, wozu? Sehen Sie, es gibt die Leute nehmen mir eine Sache übel. Und das kann ich gewissermaßen verstehen von außen. Nämlich, dass ich da noch lachen kann. Nicht? Und ich war wirklich der Meinung, dass der Eichmann ein Hanswurst ist. Und ich sage Ihnen, ich habe dieses Polizeiverhör 3600 Seiten gelesen und sehr genau gelesen. Und ich weiß nicht, wie oft ich gelacht habe, aber laut. Eichmann war ganz intelligent, aber diese Dummheit hatte er. Das war die Dummheit, die so empörend war. Und das habe ich eigentlich gemeint mit der Banalität. Da ist keine Tiefe, das ist nicht dämonisch. Das ist einfach der Unwille, sich je vorzustellen, was eigentlich mit dem anderen ist. Nicht wahr? Ich habe keineswegs gemeint, der Eichmann sitzt in uns, jeder von uns hat den Eichmann und weiß der Deibel was. Nichts dergleichen.
Trotz allem weiß ich natürlich, dass ich meine Hände nicht in Unschuld waschen kann. Weil die Tatsache, dass ich ein absoluter Befehlsempfänger war, heute sicherlich nichts mehr bedeutet. Obgleich an meinen Händen kein Blut klebt, werde ich sicherlich der Beihilfe zum Mord schuldig gesprochen werden.
Evil is a surface phenomenon. We resist evil by not being swept away without thinking by the surface appearance of conventional things. We do it by reaching another dimension, which lies beyond the horizon of everyday life. In other words, the more superficial someone is, the more likely he will be to yield to evil. That is the banality of evil. An indication of such superficiality was the use of clichés. And Eichmann, God knows, was a perfect example.
Aber wie dem auch sei, ich bin innerlich bereit, auch persönlich für das furchtbare Geschehen zu sühnen. Und ich weiß, dass mir die Todesstrafe bevorsteht. Ich bitte auch gar nicht um Gnade, denn es steht mir nicht zu. Ja, wenn es einen größeren Akt der Sühneleistung bedeutet, bin ich bereit, als abschreckendes Beispiel für alle die letzten Vorkommnisse bekundeten Antisemiten der Länder dieser Erde, mich selbst öffentlich zu erhängen.
היא לא באה בסימפתיה, בהזדהות, באהבה, אלא בהקטנת הרשעה ואת העוול. ברגע שאתה אומר בנאליות של הרוע, כבר כשלעצמו אתה לוקח. אנשים שעברו את השואה, זה לא היה בנאלי, זה היה רק במונחים של מפלצת. זאת הייתה התחושה. על זה מדברים במונחים של מפלצת.
People went berserk. The language that was used to attack her, what people said when they got up, survivors, children of survivors, relatives. You're accusing someone of being a traitor, a moral equivalent of the murderers, besmirching the innocence of the death of all the victims. I mean, completely outrageous.
The American Jewish community made up the mind that she's exonerating Eichmann. She's a self-hating Jew. She is an anti-Zionist, and used every tactic to type of discredit. It went on, you know. I would find myself, as late as 10 years ago, I'd give a lecture on Eichmann in Jerusalem, and somebody in the audience would get up and start screaming at me. How could I defend this vicious anti-Semite?
October 1906. Hannah Arendt was born on October 14, 1906 at 9:15 p.m. on a Sunday. Labor lasted 22 hours and delivery was routine. The child weighed 3.695 kilos. Her eyes are gray-blue, her ears are big, her nose is rather wide, and her mouth very small. Her skin color is not smooth. The little one is outdoors whenever the weather permits. On warm days, up to 3.5 hours. She's vivacious and cheery, a true chatterbox. She says the words father, auntie, and thank you when someone gives her something. When someone asks, what's your name? She says, Haya Arendt. She turned 4 in October. She's an opinionated girl who looks older than she is. She sings often with a passion, but she's off-key. I don't think she has any artistic skills. She has an intellectual side to her, perhaps a skill in itself. But more than anything, she loves letters and books. Her father died in October. She perceives this as a sad event for me. She herself is not affected. In order to console me, she says, Mother, it happens to so many women. She cries at the funeral because the singing is so beautiful. She's extremely sensitive. I see my youth in her, and it saddens me that she too will be tormented by men as I was. But one's destiny cannot be spared.
Können Sie mir aus Ihrer Erinnerung erzählen, was es seinerzeit für ein Kind in Deutschland bedeutet hat, aus einer jüdischen Familie zu stammen?
Sehen Sie, die erste Sache, ich habe von Hause aus nicht gewusst, dass ich Jüdin bin. Meine Mutter war gänzlich religiös.
Ihr Vater ist früh gestorben?
Mein Vater ist früh gestorben. Und die Frage hat keine Rolle für sie gespielt. Sie war selbstverständlich Jüdin. Sie würde mich nie getauft haben. Ich nehme an, sie würde mich rechts und links geohrfeigt haben. Wäre sie je dahinter gekommen, dass ich etwa verleugnet hätte, Jüdin zu sagen. Kam nicht auf die Platte sozusagen. Kam gar nicht in Frage. Wenn also, sagen wir mal, von den Lehrern antisemitische Bemerkungen gemacht wurden, meistens gar nicht mit Bezug auf mich, sondern Bezug auf andere jüdische Schülerinnen, zum Beispiel ostjüdische Schülerinnen, nicht? Dann war ich angewiesen, von zu Hause sofort aufzustehen, die Klasse zu verlassen, nach Hause zu kommen, alles genau zu Protokoll zu geben. Dann schrieb meine Mutter einen ihrer vielen eingeschriebenen Briefe. Und die Sache war für mich natürlich völlig erledigt. Ich hatte einen Tag schulfrei und war doch ganz schön. Es gab Verhaltensmaßregeln, in denen ich sozusagen meine Würde behielt und geschützt war. Absolut geschützt zu Hause.
The quiet sorrow which settles down after a catastrophe has never come to pass. The explosion of the First World War touched off a chain reaction in which we have been caught ever since, and which nobody seems to be able to stop. Its civil wars were not only bloodier and crueler than all their predecessors, they were followed by migrations of groups who were welcomed nowhere and could be assimilated nowhere. Once they had left their homeland, they remained homeless. Once they had left their state, they became stateless. And once they had been deprived of their human rights, they were rightless. They became the scum of the earth, superfluous. So the insane mass manufacture of corpses in Nazi time was preceded by the historical preparation of living corpses of refugees.
היא בת הדור הזה של בין שתי מלחמות העולם מאבד את הזכויות שלו. לפליטות הזאת, שמצד אחד הייתה חוויה קיומית קשה ביותר, היה גם ערך עצום בשבילה, והיא שימרה את המצב הקיומי הזה, המצב התודעתי והמצב הנפשי של פליטה, היא שימרה כל ימי חייה. היא האמינה שהיא מנקודת המבט הזאת, שמחוץ לבית, שמחוץ להמון, שמחוץ לקולקטיב, מאפשרת באמת נקודת תצפית מאוד מחודדת ומאוד ייחודית, ואולי גם נכונה יותר, אם אפשר לומר ככה, לעולם.
For me, at least, that's the most important thing she has to say about it, that these people have no rights. And in that sense, they are superfluous. They are superfluous to the political world. They are rightless people. They have no right whatsoever. She said, a criminal who commits a crime, who is a citizen of a state, he may be imprisoned, but he has rights. This refugee, this stateless person, has no rights at all, none.
Denationalization and xenophobia became a powerful weapon of totalitarian politics. Those who were defined by their persecutors as scum of the earth, Jews, Trotskyites, and the like, were treated as such wherever they went. Those unwanted by oppressive governments became the unwanted of Europe. In time, the official SS newspaper explicitly stated that if the world is not yet convinced that the Jews are the scum of the earth, it will soon be convinced when these beggars without citizenship, without money and passports, cross over their borders. Before they seize power and establish their world according to their doctrine, totalitarian movements conjure up a false, ideological, and consistent world, which is more in tune with the needs of the human mind than reality itself. What the masses refuse to recognize is the random nature of reality. They are predisposed to all ideologies because they explain facts as mere laws and eliminate coincidences and spontaneity by inventing an all-embracing omnipotence, which is supposed to be at the root of every accident. Totalitarian propaganda and ideology thrives on this escape from reality into fiction, from coincidence into consistency. Logic is its core.
The ideology creates the evil itself, like Stalinism or Hitlerism, or you have the Pol Pot in Cambodia. In each cases, you have this ideology which somehow brings people to this superfluousness, which wants to monopolize truth, which somehow wants to destroy the mode of thinking and the process of thinking and judging, and somehow also wants to put an end to the human capacity of speech and action.
Cette liberté que vous définissez, cela risque d'être la liberté de quelques-uns, de ceux qui auront la force d'inventer de nouveaux modes de pensée.
No, no. It rests only on a conviction.
Elle ne repose que sur la conviction que chaque être humain, en tant qu'être pensant, peut réfléchir aussi bien que moi et peut former son propre jugement s'il le veut.
And can therefore judge for himself if he wants to. How I can
Ce que je ne sais pas, c'est comment faire naître ce désir en lui. Réfléchir, cela signifie de toujours penser de manière critique. Et penser de manière critique, cela signifie que chaque pensée sape ce qu'il y a en fait de règles rigides et de convictions générales.
Rigid rules, general convictions, etc. Everything which happens in thinking is
Tout ce qui se passe lorsqu'on pense est soumis à un examen critique. C'est-à-dire qu'il n'existe pas de pensée dangereuse pour la simple raison que le fait de penser est en lui-même une entreprise très dangereuse.
How I can convince, I think non-thinking is even more dangerous.
It was in 1924, the University of Marburg. There I met, among the new students, this very striking young girl, Hannah Arendt. At that time, there was the great attraction for philosophers, for philosophy students, was the presence of a man by the name of Martin Heidegger, who wasn't famous yet at the time, but by word of mouth. it was known that he was a rising star or a coming power in contemporary philosophy. Anyway, he must have recognized very soon that she was something special. And very quickly they developed a personal relationship, which in a strange way lasted through Hannah Arendt's life.
February 1925. Dear Miss Arendt, everything should be simple and clear and pure between us. Only then will we be worthy of having been allowed to meet. You are my pupil and I your teacher, but that is only the circumstances of what's happened to us. I will never be able to call you mine, but from now on you will belong in my life. You have lost your disquiet, which means you have found your way to the innermost, purest feminine essence. Someday you will be grateful, not to me, that this visit to my office hour was your decisive retreat from the path of academic research, which only men can endure. We must not think of ourselves as soulmates, something no one ever experiences. I cannot and do not want to separate your loyal eyes and beautiful figure from your pure trust, the honor and goodness of your girlish essence. Yours, Martin. My dear Hannah, today I greeted you during my lecture and was happy that you were there. The lecture is still a strain for me, but I hope I'll pull through and not be as overwhelmed by the flu as my wife was. My wife will need a rather long time to recover, and for the time being, I can't imagine how the household will be maintained. I'm writing this to you, even though I know you do not expect an excuse for my silence. Much love, yours, Martin. My dear Hannah, do you want to come see me this Sunday evening? I live in joy for such moments. Come around 9 o'clock. If the lamp is lit in my room, though, I will have been delayed by a meeting. My dear Hannah, I would be very glad if you came to see me today at 8:45 in the evening. If the light is on in my room, then I am home. It will be hard for us to see each other this week. In any case, definitely Tuesday the 26th. You'll still be here, won't you? But only after 9 o'clock. Yours, Martin.
Die Beziehung zu den Frauen, denke ich, waren immer auch ein Mittel zum Zweck, wenn er wieder auch geistige Anregungen brauchte, denn es waren eigentlich durchweg Frauen, die auch Akademikerinnen waren, gebildet waren, die ihn bewundert haben natürlich, und das hat ihn beflügelt, denke ich, in der Arbeit. Also zum Beispiel Hannah Arendt ist sicher sozusagen die Geburtshelferin von Sein und Zeit in der Zeit, also in dieser Phase. Und so war es, denke ich, auch mit den anderen Frauen. Aber es war ja eine heimliche Liebe und eine schwierige Liebe auch. Vom Altersunterschied her und von der Rolle her, Professor, Studentin, es war keine gleichberechtigte Liebe.
(1925). Every time I woke up from the long, dreamy, and yet deep sleep in which one merges entirely with what one dreams, I felt the same shy, caring, probing tenderness towards the things of the world. This made clear to me how much of my actual life had sunken completely into itself, like sleep. Indeed, when the simplicity and ordinariness of life struck me to the core, it did not occur to me that all the suffering I experienced would be so banal, a worthless nothing, that everybody just took for granted.
April 1925. Tottenauberg. My dearest, fragmentation and despair will never overpower your supportive love for my work. Your letter moved me for days. The parts, if you want to have me, if you like. What can I do in the face of such shy and yet so resolute waiting? Such persistence. Good night, dearest Hannah. Your Martin.
Canningsburg, 1925. Perhaps my youth will struggle free of the spell. Perhaps my soul will realize what it is to speak out under a different sky, and thus overcome sickness and confusion and learn simplicity and the freedom of organic growth. But it's more likely that I'll continue to pursue my life in idle experiments and with curiosity, until finally the long and eagerly awaited end takes me, putting an arbitrary stop to my useless activity. June 1929. Dear Professor Jaspers, please forgive me for sending you the second version of my dissertation only now. I got married 4 weeks ago. My husband and I are now in Heidelberg. I would very much like to see you if you would let me know when it would be convenient. Your most devoted, Hannah Arendt Stern.
Oh, Jaspers was, I think she almost admits that. Her father died when she was very young, and Jaspers, in many senses, took her father's place. And I think she was well aware of that. And then later on, they became just friends, just really great friends. She once said, Jaspers is the man I can say anything to. I don't have to be afraid of offending him. He can say anything he wants to me. We cannot offend each other. Yeah. We cannot offend each other. They were closer than even though they disagreed. They might disagree completely about something. Well, they disagreed about Heidegger, for one thing, although she said terrible things about Heidegger to Jaspers. Terrible. But
why are you so excited?
Pardon me?
Does it excite you to speak about Jaspers?
Yeah, it moves me, because that was truly one of the great relationships, I think, in our time, in the 20th century.
Berlin, January 1st, 1933. Dear Professor Jaspers, thank you so much for your article about the sociologist Max Weber. It does not bother me that you portray Max Weber as the great German, but rather that you find the German essence in him and identify that essence with rationality and humanity which originated in passion. For me, as a Jew, Germany means my mother tongue, philosophy, and literature. I cannot be for or against it when I read Max Weber's wonderful sentence where he says that to put Germany back on her feet, he would form an alliance with the devil himself. And it is this sentence that reveals the critical point here. The text stressed that freedom is not to be identified with Germanness, but in the introduction, you make rationality and humanity out to be something like basic qualities of the German character. Yours, Hannah Arendt Stern.
Dear Frau Stern, I find it odd that you, as a Jew, want to set yourself apart from what is German. My reason for choosing that somewhat odd formulation probably had to do with my own pedagogical impulse. Our nationalistic youth have so much goodwill tangled up in their confused and wrong-headed jabbering that I wanted to make them aware of the demands on themselves that are inherent in being German, while at the same time acknowledging their need to feel pride in being German. The word German is so much misused that one can hardly use it at all anymore. I made the attempt, hopeless perhaps, to give it ethical content through the figure of Max Weber. That attempt, however, would have proved successful only if you too could say, "That's the way it is. I also want to be a German." Dear regards to your husband, yours, Karl Jaspers.
Dear Professor Jaspers, what troubled me first of all is the term German character. You say yourself how misused it is. For me, it's almost identical with misuse. I cannot identify with that because I do not have in myself, so to speak, any sign of German character. Germany in its old glory is your past. What my Germany is can hardly be expressed in one phrase. Any oversimplification, whether it is that of the Zionists, the assimilationists, or the anti-Semites, only serves to obscure the true problem. As always, yours, Hannah Stern.
Gibt es in Ihrer Erinnerung ein exaktes Vorkommnis, von dem an Sie Ihre Hinwendung zum Politischen datieren könnten?
Ja, wissen Sie, in gewissem Sinne kann ich sagen, am 27. Februar 1933 Reichstagsbrand und die darauf in derselben Nacht erfolgenden illegalen Verhaftungen, die sogenannten Schutzhaft. Danach, Sie wissen, die Leute kamen in Gestapo-Keller oder in Konzentrationslager. Dies war für mich ein unmittelbarer Schock. Ich war nicht mehr der Meinung, dass man jetzt einfach zusehen kann.
In the summer of 1924, Franz Kafka died. Today, we know that Kafka's detention was not a mere nightmare. In his search for the real reasons for his ordeal, Kay turns to the prison chaplain for advice, and he preaches the hidden greatness of the system and orders him not to ask for the truth. For it is not necessary to accept everything as true. One must accept it as necessary, a no-choice situation. A melancholy conclusion, said Kay. It turns lying into a universal principle. True enough, the force of the machinery lies precisely in this appearance of necessity on the one hand, and in the admiration of the people for necessity on the other. Lying for the sake of necessity appears as something that is most sublime. It has been characteristic of our history consciousness that its worst crimes have been committed in the name of some kind of necessity, or in the name of a mythological future.
Concentration camps was one of the things you found immediately necessary upon coming to power, was it not? And you set them up as a matter of necessity, as you saw it.
Dinge wurden notwendig aufgrund der vorhandenen Gegnerschaft.
Yes. And I assume that that is the only kind of government that you think can function in Germany under present conditions.
Unter den damaligen Umständen war sie nach meiner Auffassung die einzig mögliche Form und sie hat auch gezeigt, dass Deutschland aus seinem tiefen Elend der Verarmung und Arbeitslosigkeit in kurzer Zeit zu einer verhältnismäßigen Blüte wieder gekommen war. Selbstverständlich wurde auch da und dort geschlagen und es sind Rohheitsakte verübt worden. Aber gemessen an all dem Gewesenen und an der Größe des Vorgangs ist doch diese deutsche Freiheitsrevolution die unblutigste und disziplinierteste aller bisherigen Revolutionen der Geschichte gewesen.
Mein Führer, meine Kameraden, nach Ihrem Befehl, mein Führer, nach Ihnen formt sich die junge Generation unseres Volkes, weil sie die höchste Selbstlosigkeit dieser Nation voranleben. Will auch diese Jugend selbstlos sein. Adolf Hitler, der Führer der deutschen Jugend, hat das Wort.
The trouble with totalitarian regimes is not that they play power politics in an especially ruthless way, but that behind their politics is hidden an entirely new and deceptive concept of reality. Idealism, that is, unwavering faith in an ideological, fictitious world, rather than just a lust for power.
Meine deutsche Jugend, wir wollen einst keine Klassen und Stände mehr sehen. Und ihr dürft in euch schon nicht mehr groß werden lassen. Wir wollen, dass dieses Volk einst friedliebend und aber auch tapfer ist. Und ihr müsst friedfertig sein.
Dear students, the concept of freedom for German students is now being restored to its true meaning, out of which the future loyalty and service of German youth would evolve. Camaraderie marks the individual with an imprint that carries him beyond himself. We know the resoluteness of their expressions, the stern clarity of their gaze, their decisive handshake, their uncompromising way of speaking. This new race is at every moment emerging. Now this student will become a worker.
Und ich weiß, das kann nicht anders sein. Denn ihr seid Fleisch, von unserem Fleisch und Blut, von unserem Blut. Und in euren jungen Gehirn brennt dasselbe Geist, der uns beherrscht.
German students, may you ceaselessly grow in the courage to sacrifice yourselves for the salvation of our nation's essential being, and the increase of its innermost strength of its polity. The Führer, himself and he alone, is German reality, present and future, and its law. Heil Hitler!
Es war, als ob sich ein leerer Raum um einen bildete. Nun, ich lebte in einem intellektuellen Milieu. Und ich kannte aber auch andere Menschen. Und ich konnte feststellen, dass unter Intellektuellen das sozusagen die Regel war. Und unter den anderen nicht. Und die Geschichte habe ich nie vergessen. Und mit einer Sache ging ich raus aus Deutschland. Wie ich damals dachte, natürlich immer etwas übertreibend. Nie wieder. Ich rühre nie wieder irgendeine intellektuelle Geschichte an. Ich will mit dieser Gesellschaft nichts zu tun haben. Ich war ja natürlich nicht der Meinung, dass also nun deutsche Juden oder deutsch-jüdische Intellektuelle, wenn sie in einer anderen Situation gewesen wären, als in der sie waren, sich wesentlich anders verhalten hätten. Das Schlimme war doch, dass sie dann wirklich daran glaubten. Für kurze Zeit, manche für sehr kurze Zeit. Das heißt, zu Hitler fiel ihnen was ein. Und zum Teil ungeheuer interessante Dinge, nicht? Ganz fantastisch interessante und komplizierte und hoch über dem gewöhnlichen Niveau schwebende Dinge. Das habe ich als grotesk empfunden.
L'ennemi est celui-là et tout un chacun qui fait planer une menace essentielle contre l'existence du peuple et de ses membres. L'ennemi peut s'être hanté, greffé sur la racine la plus intérieure de l'existence du peuple et s'opposer à l'essence propre de celui-ci, agir contre lui.
The underlying requirement is then to find the enemy, to bring him to light, or even to create him, in order that there may be a standing up to the enemy, and that our existence would not become apathetic. It is often much harder to seek out the enemy as such and to lead him to reveal himself, to avoid nurturing illusions about him, to remain ready to attack and to cultivate constant preparedness to attack on a long-term basis, with the goal of total extermination.
On peut dire qu'il manifeste dans son cours, dès 1933, une intention génocidaire à l'égard du peuple juif, parce que cet ennemi antérieur greffé sur le peuple allemand, c'est d'abord et avant tout le juif assimilé. Donc ma thèse, c'est que le fond de la doctrine heideggerienne est nazi, et qu'il n'est philosophe qu'en apparence. Il utilise une partie du langage philosophique pour légitimer un contenu qui n'est pas philosophique, car une doctrine raciale d'extermination, à mon avis, ne peut pas être une philosophie.
She didn't think Heidegger was an evil man, and it is not, Heidegger never killed anybody or anything like that. He never, he was absolutely bamboozled. He was made a fool of. He made a fool of himself. But this was a real thinker. But when she said, when the chips are down, that's when thinking becomes a phenomenon. It enters the phenomenal world as judgment. No, I will not do that. Heidegger didn't do it. He didn't say, no, I will not become rector.
But this is exactly the banality of evil, suspending thought.
Well, that yeah, it is in a way a counterpart, I suppose, yes.
לנאשם לקום. מה בכלל הייתה דעתך על כך, על ההשקפה הנאצית שצריך להרחיק את היהודים מגרמניה?
In den Jahren 34, 35 hatte ich überhaupt mir noch keine Gedanken diesbezüglich gemacht.
אמרת לנו שמעולם לא היית אנטישמי.
Antisemit war ich nicht, nein.
שקט. שקט, אני מבקש. אתה תסכים איתי שזה לכאורה פרדוקס, נציונל סוציאליסט, בעל הכרה שאיננו אנטישמי בעל הכרה.
Erscheint.
Ja.
Aber es muss nicht sein. Um jene Zeit war ich berufstätig bei der Vakuum-Ölkompanie, Interessen nachgegangen und die hießen weder Literatur noch hießen sie ähnliche geistige Angelegenheiten.
Of course he wasn't an anti-Semite. He never hated his victims. Had Eichmann been a bit less prim, or the police examination less discreet, his so-called lack of prejudice might have shown itself in still another way. It seems that in Vienna, where he was so extraordinarily successful in arranging the forced emigration of Jews, he had a Jewish mistress, an old flame from Linz.
Und was Sie Idealismus nennen, Sie nennen sich ein Idealist auch für jene Zeit.
Jawohl. Ich verstand darunter, den gepredigten Nationalismus anzuhängen und als Nationalist gemäß meinem Eid meine Pflicht zu tun. Ja. Das verstand ich darunter. Ja. Und es ist mir heute klar, dass jeder Nationalismus in seiner überspitzten Form zum krassen Egoismus führt und von dort aus ist es zum Radikalismus nicht mehr sehr weit.
He was certainly an idealist. An idealist, according to Eichmann, isn't only someone who believes in his idea, but he also lives for this idea. And he's ready to sacrifice everything for it, and especially everyone. The longer one listened to him, the more obvious it became that his inability to speak was closely connected with an inability to think, namely to think from the standpoint of somebody else. And the German society of 80 million people had been shielded against reality and factuality by exactly the same means. The same self-deception, lies, and dumbness that had now become ingrained in Eichmann's mentality.
I think she believed Eichmann. She saw Eichmann as the little man. She saw Eichmann as the bureaucrat. She saw Eichmann as the desk murderer. She fails to see or fails to give enough credence to the fact, or gravitas to the fact, that this man is a committed, in his heart, anti-Semite. That he wasn't doing this just because he was told, you know, move these Jews here, and so he moves them here. That he was esprent, boer, it was burning for him. It was burning for him.
Oh, no, I'm sure he was anti-Semitic, and I'm sure that he loved his Führer and that he swore allegiance to the Nazi ideology. I mean, there's no question about that. So it is this non-thinking adoption of fascist, racist ideologies, which she is saying belongs to a kind of new way of life, a new modality. It has become, under those conditions, it became normal. It is hideous that it's normal. It's hideous that it is banal. Right? If we say that this evil became banal, ordinary, taken for granted, normal, we are describing a very hideous reality. So she is not saying it is banal. She's saying it's a new form of hideousness that is able to pass itself off as the normal, which is why we have to be all the more alert.
Thinking is the place where you actually inhabit an alienated space from the norm. But Eichmann was anything but alienated from his Nazi milieu. He was a proper Nazi subject. So his homeliness, his dwelling in a Nazi milieu is his banality. That there was no dissonance. It's not that he didn't know, but he didn't experience dissonance between what he's doing necessarily and what the norm is.
Ewiger Wald, ewiges Volk. Es lebt der Baum wie du und ich. Er strebt zum Raum wie du und ich. Volk steht wie Wald in Ewigkeit.
It is the monstrous claim of totalitarian rule that it is completely legal. Far from being arbitrary, it is obedient to superhuman forces. Far from wielding its power in self-interest, it is quite prepared to sacrifice everybody's vital interest to the execution of what it assumes to be the law of history or the law of nature, the sources of authority on all laws. The survival of the fittest is as much an historical law as it is a natural law, and could be used by racism as such. The law of nature and the law of history, if properly executed, are expected to produce a new breed of human being.
Wir Menschen haben gegen dieses Gesetz der natürlichen Auslese in den letzten Jahrzehnten furchtbar gesündigt. Wir haben unwertes Leben nicht nur erhalten, wir haben ihm auch Vermehrung gewährt. Die Nachkommen dieser Kranken sahen so aus.
In the process of elimination of the objective enemy of history or nature, of class or race, guilt and innocence become senseless notions. Guilty is he who stands in the way of natural or historical process which passed its judgment over inferior races, over dying classes and decadent people. The verdict of extermination. Man is a social animal, and life is not easy for him when social ties are cut off. Lacking the courage to fight for change to our social and legal status, we have decided instead, so many of us, to try to change our identity. We don't want to be refugees since we don't want to be Jews. We don't call ourselves stateless because the majority of stateless people are Jews. If patriotism were a matter of practice, we should be the most patriotic people in the world. The human being who's lost his place in a community, his political status in the struggle of the times, and his legal persona, loses the meaning of speech and all human connections. He's left with those qualities which usually become relevant only in the sphere of his private life. This mere naked existence that is all that is mysteriously given to us by birth, and which includes the shape of our bodies and the talents of our minds, can be affirmed only by the unpredictable friendship and sympathy, or by the great and incalculable grace of love, which says, "I want you to be," without being able to give any particular reason for such supreme affirmation.
החסד של האהבה, היא שוב מדברת מתוך החוויה האישית שלה. כאשר היא פליטה בפריז, בתוך קבוצה שלמה של פליטים כאלה שנזרקו למעשה מתוך ההיסטוריה, ומתוך האנושות, היא שם פוגשת את אהבת חייה. והאהבה הזאת באמת גואלת אותה במובן מסוים, ונותנת לה תחושה של בית בעולם.
May 1936, Paris. Dearest, I went back from Clamart and want to continue our conversation while your voice is still fresh in my ear. I will send this letter to your train so that it can accompany you to the Zionist Congress in my place. This letter won't get in the way of your discussion with colleagues on the train, as I surely would have done, but will pounce on the first free moment you have. With much devotion, your Heinrich.
My dear Heinrich, it became clear during my journey how important all this is to me. I literally felt as if someone had stripped the skin from my body. My remark about being a young girl for you made me blush. What I meant was if I had only met you 10 years earlier. But in the meantime, unfortunately, I was forced to some extent to stop being a woman. Forgive me, my love, if you can, for this brutal honesty. I wanted to dissolve my marriage 3 years ago. Separation would have been the most natural outcome for the other party, but he never thought it was necessary. The Jewish Congress is to begin in half an hour. The participants can be grouped into Messiah trumpeters and rationalists. I belong to the latter group, but with a good dose of loudmouth thrown in. Because, my dear, for me, Palestine is the center of our national aspirations, not because 2,000 years ago some people lived there from whom we are supposed to be descended, but because for 2,000 years the craziest of people took pleasure in preserving our past in the present. Because for them, the ruins of Jerusalem are rooted in the heart of time. Think of me, and don't forget how to kiss. Hannah.
The Jewish pariah, which was her main obsession in the 30s and 40s, the notion that the Jew was displaced by not having a political home, made her very energetic in the Zionist movement. And she had a very close friendship with Kurt Blumenfeld. She was a real Zionist.
היא גיבורה ציונית בשנות ה-30. בשנות ה-40, כאשר היא רואה את הכיוונים שאליהם הולכת התנועה הציונית. החתירה העיקשת והמתמדת אל עבר ריבונות לאומית. ולה הייתה בעיה גדולה עם המופע הפוליטי הזה שנקרא מדינת אומה, מדינת לאום. היא הכירה את המדרון הזה שהוליך ממדינת אומה, שהלאומיות השתלטה עליה, חדלה להיות מדינת כל האזרחים, ונהפכת מדינת הרוב הלאומי שלה.
My dear friend Heinrich, that indeed is the question. Can I take the seat at your side that you have generously offered me? The reason it is so terrible to be a Jewess is because one must constantly legitimize oneself. I am of the opinion that one cannot and must never legitimize oneself. It is always others who had to do the legitimizing, and these others in my life have not wanted to, and I do not fit into a tradition in which a simple stroke of the pen can cross me out. Look, you said yourself everything speaks against us. What is this everything, apart from the prejudices that I am a Jew and you are not? I think that I love you, I mean it. I kiss your mouth and nose. H.
Dearest, your letter arrived yesterday. I can breathe again, feeling myself with your love. I believe you. Many women have told me they loved me, but I never believed a single one of them. One thing I know for certain. With you, there can be no lasting contradiction between words and actions. Hannah, we shouldn't be ashamed. It is our great love. Let's lose ourselves in it completely. Many kisses, Heinrich.
Well, my love, whether I can be your wife, I don't know. My doubts have not disappeared, and neither has the fact that I'm married. Until now, I didn't notice much of the hell that my home was, for I was working like a horse and was almost never there. Now, divorce is inevitable. H. No, something is very wrong with our optimism. We were expelled from Germany because we were Jews. But as soon as we crossed the French border, we were seen as bochers, yeshiva boys. In the meantime, most of us had indeed become such loyal Frenchmen that we didn't even criticize the French government's decrees. So we declared it was all right to be interned. We were the first voluntary prisoners that history had ever seen. After the Germans invaded the country, they had only to change the name of the firm. Having been jailed because we are Germans, we are not freed because we are Jews.
coming from the darkness of Germany. She came to this country and she saw plurality, and she saw diversity, and she saw things that she had never seen before, the mix, the nationalities. She loved that. Yes, there was a kind of idealization, but she did see these political principles here. The fact that we are plural, that is definitely a condition of human freedom. The fact that we can think, the fact that we can act. Insofar as we are human, we are capable of spontaneous thought and action. I would right now agree with that.
Das Entscheidende ist der Tag gewesen, an dem wir von Auschwitz erfuhren. Das war 1943 und erst haben wir es nicht geglaubt. Dann haben wir es ein halbes Jahr später doch geglaubt, weil es uns bewiesen wurde. Und das ist der eigentliche Schock gewesen. Dieses hätte nicht geschehen dürfen. Da ist irgendetwas passiert, womit wir alle nicht mehr fertig werden. Und mit allen anderen Sachen, muss ich sagen, die da passiert sind, das war manchmal ein bisschen schwierig und man war sehr arm und man war verfolgt. Man musste fliehen und man musste sich durchschwindeln und was immer, nicht wie das halt so ist. Wir waren jung, mir hat sogar noch ein bisschen Spaß gemacht. Das kann ich gar nicht anders sagen. Dies nicht. Dies war etwas ganz anderes. Mit allem anderen konnte man auch persönlich fertig werden.
Totalitarian rulers rely on the tyranny of logic, against which nothing stands, but the great capacity of men to start something new, to think something new. As terror is needed to prevent that with which the birth of each new human being, a new beginning arises and raises its voice into the world. So the self-coercive force of logicality is needed lest anybody ever start thinking, which, as the freest and purest of all human activities, is the very opposite of the compulsory process of logic that ideologies are using all the time. A world in which men are taught they are superfluous, in which punishment is meted out without connection to crime, and where work is performed without product, is a place where senselessness is produced anew daily. Yet within the framework of totalitarian ideology, nothing can be more logical. If the inmate is vermin, it is logical that it will be killed by poison gas. If they are degenerate, they should not be allowed to contaminate the population. If they have slave-like souls, no one should waste his time trying to re-educate them. It is precisely for the sake of its messianic sense of redemption that it's necessary for totalitarianism to destroy every trace of what we call human dignity. For respect for human dignity implies the recognition of the uniqueness of my fellow men or our fellow nations as builders of many worlds, and as co-builders of one common world shared by all.
Kommen wir noch einmal auf Eichmann zurück und die Rolle, die die Bürokratie überhaupt beim Massenmord gespielt hat. Was bedeutet eigentlich das Eingebettetsein in einen bürokratischen Apparat für den Einzelnen? Und inwieweit verflüchtigt sich das Unrechtsbewusstsein im Instanzenzuge?
Es ist ein neuer Verbrechertyp. Ich stimme Ihnen zu. Wir stellen uns doch unter einem Verbrecher jemanden vor mit verbrecherischen Motiven. Und wenn wir uns Eichmann begucken, dann hat er verbrecherische Motive eigentlich überhaupt. Er wollte mitmachen, er wollte Wir sagen. Und dieses Mitmachen und dieses Wir sagen wollen war ja ganz genug, um die allergrößten Verbrechen möglich zu machen. Es gab eine Alternative, hüben und drüben, und die hieß nicht mitmachen. Selber urteilen, bitteschön, das mache ich nicht mit. Ich setze nicht mein Leben ein, ich versuche zu entkommen, ich versuche, wie ich um die andere Ecke komme, nicht wahr? Aber ich mache nicht mit. Und falls ich gezwungen sein sollte, mitzumachen, dann werde ich mir das Leben nehmen. Und ich würde nun sagen, dass die eigentliche Perversion des Handelns ist das Funktionieren. Und die Lust an diesem reinen Funktionieren, diese Lust, die ist ganz evident bei Eichmann gewesen. Dass er besondere Machtgelüste gehabt hat, glaube ich nicht. Er war der typische Funktionär. Und ein Funktionär ist, wenn er wirklich nichts anderes ist als ein Funktionär, ist wirklich ein sehr gefährlicher Herr. Mit Skrupeln. Es waren die Funktionäre mit Skrupeln.
Müller sagte mir, in Minsk werden die Juden verschossen. Ich möchte nicht haben, das, was ich will. Daraufhin bin ich nach Minsk gefahren. Als ich hinkam, sah ich aber gerade noch, wie junge Schützen hier in eine Grube schossen, nur gesehen habe, ohne Gedanken, ohne mir irgendwelche Gedanken zu machen. Ich habe nur gesehen, weiter nichts. Schossen hinein und ich sehe noch eine Frau, Arme nach rückwärts, und dann sind auch mir die Knie abgewandelt und ich bin weg. Das war für mich auch ungeheuerlich. Ich bin keine so robuste Natur, die, sagen wir mal, ohne irgendwelche Reagenz irgendetwas über sich, diese Art über sich ergehen lassen kann. Wenn ich heute eine krachende Schnittwunde bei einem Menschen sehe, dann kann ich nicht zusehen. Ich gehöre zu dieser Kategorie von Menschen. Sodass man mir oft sagt, ich hätte kein Arzt werden dürfen. Ich komme hin, besuche dort die Staatspolizeistelle und sage ich, wie kann man denn einfach da hier hineinknallen auf eine Frau und auf Kinder? Wie ist denn das möglich, sage ich. Das ist kann nicht. Die Leute müssen ja entweder wahnsinnig werden oder sie werden Sadisten, unsere eigenen Leute.
Ist es vielleicht so, dass die partiellen Zuständigkeiten, die jedem nur gegeben sind, die Möglichkeit moralischer Einsichten verdecken? Eichmann hat gesagt, ich saß am Schreibtisch und machte meine Sachen. Und der ehemalige Gauleiter von Danzig hat erklärt, seine offizielle Seele habe sich immer mit dem identifiziert, was er getan habe. Seine private Seele sei stets dagegen gewesen.
Ja, also dieses ist die sogenannte innere Immigration unter den Mördern. Lässt jede rastlose Tätigkeit Verantwortung verflüchtigen. Es gibt im Englischen einen idiomatischen Ausdruck, stop and think. Halt an und denk nach. Kein Mensch kann nachdenken, ohne anzuhalten. Wenn Sie jemanden in eine rastlose Tätigkeit hereinzwingen, nicht wahr, oder sich hereinzwingen lässt, dann werden Sie immer dieselbe Geschichte haben. Sie werden immer die Sache haben, dass Verantwortungsbewusstsein sich nicht bilden kann. Es kann sich nur bilden in dem Moment, wo man reflektiert, nicht über sich selbst, sondern über das, was man tut.
Haben Sie schon mal im Dunkeln geküsst, ja? Wissen Sie denn auch, wie schön sowas ist? Nein, wenn man wirklich einmal alles vergisst, so, das ist ein Blick ins Himmelreich. Waren Sie schon einmal richtig verliebt, ja? Wie es sowas sonst im Kino nur gibt, nein? Oder sind Sie etwa ganz ungeübt? Wie es darum verrate ich Ihnen.
It is not so much the barbed wire as the skillfully manufactured unreality of those whom it fences in that provokes such enormous cruelties, and ultimately makes extermination look like a perfectly normal measure. Everything that was done in the camps is known to us from the world of perverse, malignant fantasies. The difficult thing to understand is that these gruesome crimes took place in a phantom world, which, however, has materialized, as it were, into a world which is complete with all the sensual data of reality. Suddenly it becomes evident that the power of man is greater than one ever dared to think, and that man can realize hellish fantasies without making the sky fall or the earth open.
Würden Sie sagen, Frau Arendt, dass man angesichts dieses Sachverhalts noch mit dem alten, einfachen Satz zurechtkommt, es sei besser, Unrecht zu leiden, als Unrecht zu tun?
Sehen Sie, was Sokrates sofort immer wieder gesagt hat, ist, dass man diesen Satz nicht beweisen kann. Das heißt, für die einen ist er absolut evident. Und den anderen können sie nicht beweisen, dass sie so handeln müssen. Was ist also der Grund für diejenigen, für die er absolut evident ist? Dieser Satz setzt voraus, dass ich in der Tat mit mir selbst zusammenlebe, also sozusagen 2 in 1 bin. Und dass ich dann also sage, dies und dies will ich nicht tun, denn mit jemandem, der dies getan hat, will ich nicht zusammenleben. Nun, mit sich selbst zusammenleben heißt natürlich mit sich selbst sprechen. Und dies mit sich selbst sprechen ist ja im Grunde das Denken. Und zwar eine Art von Denken, das nicht technisch ist, dessen jeder Mensch fähig ist.
The well-known fact that the actual work of killing in the extermination centers and keeping order in the ghettos was usually in the hands of Jewish commandos had been fairly established by the prosecution. But this was only horrible. It was not a moral problem. It was true that the Jewish people had not been organized, that they had possessed no land, had no government, and no army, no youth with military training. But the whole truth was that the Jewish leadership cooperated in one way or another with the Nazis. The whole truth was that if the Jewish people had really been unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and plenty of misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million people.
What she says about the Jewish councils, which became such a major thing, is really a small part of the book. The way she phrased it was irresponsible. Nobody could say how many less million people would be killed if you didn't have the Jewish leaders. But at the same time, even if you read the extensive literature on the Jewish council, there were heroes, people who committed suicide, people who really wanted to protect. The complexities of it come out, but it was also scandalous.
הטענה היא שכשאתה נמצא בתוך משטר שהוא משטר של רשע, ואתה לא מסוגל להתנגד, כי אתה חלש מדי, כי העמדה שלך היא שולית מדי, כי כל הכוחות מסביבך הם נגדך, ואתה לא אמיץ מספיק בשביל לסכן את עצמך ולא רוצה להיות מרתיר, אז נשאר לך בכל זאת דבר אחד לעשות, ומה שנשאר לך לעשות זה לא לעשות כלום. זאת אומרת, לא להתברג במכונה ולהתחמק מתי שרק אפשר. והטענה שלה נגד היהודים הייתה שהם התנדבו מהר מדי להתברג במכונה הנאצית.
בינואר 39 נשלחתי עם טרנספורט של ילדים יהודים שאורגן אז על ידי הארגון של הקהילות לבלגיה.
מיד אחרי האקציה של נובמבר 38.
של נובמבר 38.
אתה נשלחת לי...
היית אז כאשר נשלחת? אני הייתי בן 11. אנחנו עבדנו בתחילה בשביל הקהילה היהודית בכל מיני תפקידים, לעתים גם בשביל הגסטאפו הצטרכנו לבנות דברים מסוימים, כן. ואחר כך הוטל עלינו התפקיד לעזור בבניין המחנה לאיסוף היהודים לפני המשלוח.
מה היה מן העזרה שנדרשת להושיט?
הצטרכנו לעזור לחלשים וחולים כשהם הובלו לרכבות. ראיתי איך שהובילו את החולים האלה עם המיטות ממש לרכבת. ביום השלישי בלילה בשעה 3 סגרו את הצריף הרמטי, ואז ראש הצריף קרא שמות האנשים הנידונים למשלוח. רשימה א' ב' ואני צריך להגיד מכל הדברים הנוראים שראיתי, מכות רצח ועוד ועוד, עליי נשאר רושם חזק ביותר, וגם על אחרים, של אותו לילה, יום שלישי, בבוקר ב3, כשהיה שקט גמור וחושך, כאילו היו קוראים פסק דין מוות לאותם האנשים שנשלוחים.
In Amsterdam, as in Warsaw, in Berlin, as in Budapest, Jewish officials could be trusted to compile the lists of persons and of their property. We know how the officials felt when they became instruments of murder. Like captains whose ships were about to sink, and who succeeded in bringing them safe to port by casting overboard a great part of their precious cargo. Like saviors who, with 100 victims, save 1,000 people. With 1,000, 10,000. In order not to leave the selection to blind fate, a truly holy principle was needed as the guiding force of the weak human hand which puts down on paper the name of the unknown person, and with this decides his life or death. To a Jew, This role of the Jewish leaders in the destruction of their own people is undoubtedly the darkest chapter of the whole dark story.
טוב, אז עד שהגענו למסקנה שזה היה מיעוט קטן בין אנשי היודנאטים, כן? או בכלל בין יודנאטים. היו, אבל זה היה מיעוט קטן. אצל הרוב הגדול לא היו רשימות, ולא שיתוף פעולה, ולא בטיח. הייתה כניעה לכוח עליון נאצי, שאי אפשר היה להתנגד לו בשום צורה, כי הנאצים שלטו.
I am even more struck today than I was 30 years ago by the historical ignorance she displays in her general and global accusation. It was easy for her to consult any history of that period, to be more nuanced, to write differently. She regretted it. When I interviewed her 10 years later, she said in a rather sober tone that although there was an organized campaign against her by the Jewish establishment in the United States and Israel. But she said, I also irritated many honest, decent people, and she seemed to regret deeply there.
Man muss sich klar sein, dass unter totalitären Bedingungen es das Phänomen der Ohnmacht gibt. Und man muss sich klar sein, dass es auch unter Bedingungen der absoluten Ohnmacht noch Verhaltungsweisen gibt. Das heißt, dass das nicht besagt, dass man unbedingt auch ein Verbrecher werden muss. Erstens ist natürlich die Art und Weise der unbewältigten Vergangenheit, die man gemeinsam hat, sehr verschieden zwischen Opfern und Tätern. Denn auch die Judenräte, sie sind deshalb noch nicht hundertprozentig entschuldigt, aber selbstverständlich stehen sie auf der anderen Seite. Das ist ja offenbar.
The Christian world owes to the Jew reparation for all the centuries of wrong and hurt and humiliation. Reparation for the awful and tragic Hitler years. That reparation will be a free and democratic Jewish commonwealth inherits Israel, even though it means little or nothing for other peoples. Terrorism must...
American Zionists, from left to right, adopted unanimously the demand for a free and democratic Jewish commonwealth, which shall embrace the whole of Palestine. This is a turning point in Zionist history, for it means that the revisionist program, so long bitterly repudiated, has finally proved victorious. This time, the Arabs were simply not mentioned in the solution, which obviously leaves them the choice between voluntary immigration and second-class citizenship. A home that my neighbor does not recognize is not a home. A Jewish national home that is not recognized and not respected by its neighboring people is not a home, but an illusion, until it becomes a battlefield. This is proof of the illusionist, utopian, and apolitical element that has so often been a part of Jewish politics in Palestine, and which first expresses itself in an overestimation of what was practical and opportunistic. Socialism, which was once an inspiring source of the revolutionary labor movement, laid the heavy hand of dialectical necessity upon the heads and hearts of its followers, until they were willing to fit into almost any inhuman conditions. Another traditionally Zionist feeling that has by now seized all sections of Jewish people is the cynical and deep-rooted conviction that all Gentiles are anti-Semitic, and everybody and everything is against the Jews. The notion that we can use our enemies for our own salvation has always been, for me, the original sin of Zionism. Thus, the socialist, revolutionary Jewish national movement, which started half a century ago, with ideas so lofty that it overlooked the particular realities of the Middle East and the general wickedness of the world, has ended, as do most such movements, with unequivocal support not only of national but of chauvinist claims, not against enemies of the Jewish people, but against its possible friends and present neighbors. Obviously, this attitude is plain racist chauvinism, and it is equally obvious that this division between Jews and all other people who are to be classed as enemies does not differ from other master race theories.
I think just as she thought the Germans ought to have lived with the Jews and the other minorities, she thought the Jews had to live with the Palestinians, and that the whites had to live with the blacks, and that plurality, this idea of plurality, was essential to our way of living together politically. There was no doing away with plurality, right? If you try to do away with plurality, you become genocidal. Okay? That just seems absolutely crucial to me. So that has become very important to my thinking. And it's amazing how angry people get at you, though, when you say things like this. I don't know why they get so angry. It seems kind of commonsensical.
December 1945. Dear Hannah Arendt, tears came to my eyes as I read your letter. I felt how rare that spirit is. Yes, the few mustn't be too few, but the very few suffice to give one hope. Tell me about your life. How bemused you would be if you came into our apartment here. It's the same rooms, as if nothing had happened. You could sit in the chair at my desk again, the way you used to as a doctoral candidate. Yet everything is different. This is only a ghostly continuation from the past that made its way into this transformed world. Shocking voices rise from the Nuremberg trials. It will take time to figure them out. With warmest wishes, yours, Karl Jaspers.
Will you explain to the tribunal why you believe that the type of execution ordered by you was preferable to the shooting in the neck?
Auf der einen Seite sollte damit erreicht werden, dass die einzelnen Führer und Männer auf militärische Weise durch Befehl die Hinrichtung vollziehen konnten und daher keinen eigenen Entschluss zu fassen brauchten, sondern lediglich auf Befehl, auch äußerlich handelten. Zum anderen war mir bekannt, dass bei den Einzelhinrichtungen durch seelische Erregungen sich Misshandlungen nicht vermeiden ließen, da die Opfer zu früh von ihrer Hinrichtung erfuhren und daher nervenmäßig einer längeren Belastung nicht standhielten. Ebenso erschien es mir unerträglich, dass einzelne Führer und Männer diese Weise gezwungen wurden, in eigenem Entschluss eine große Zahl von Tötungen vorzunehmen.
My beloved teacher, if I were sitting on your chair, I would have probably told you more. I am married again for 9 years to a German, and I haven't become more respectable in any way. If I had wanted to become respectable, I would have either have had to give up my interest in Jewish affairs or not marry a non-Jewish man. Either option equally inhuman. Regarding Heidegger's behavior in 1933, it is a fact that he prohibited his teacher and friend, Professor Adwin Husserl, to enter the philosophy faculty because he was a Jew. I know that this letter was an official form, and I know that many people have excused it for that reason. Always seemed to me that the moment Heidegger was obliged to put his name to this document, he should have resigned. However foolish he may have been, he was capable of understanding that. Now, you might say that this happened in the rush of business, and I would probably reply that the truly irreparable things happen often and deceptively, almost like accidents, and when one steps easily across the red line, feeling certain that it is of no consequence anymore. That wall, which rises up, is what truly divides people. In other words, because I know that this signature almost killed Husserl, I can't help but regard Heidegger as a potential murderer. You'll be familiar with the various interviews he gave. Nothing but insane lies with what I think is clearly a pathological streak. And then, of course, this whole intricate and childish dishonesty must have crept into his philosophizing. Yours, as always, Hannah. What stuck in the mind of these men who had become murderers was simply the notion of being involved in something historic, grandiose, and unique. This was important because the murderers were not sadists or killers by nature. Hence, the problem was how to overcome their animal instinct of pity, by which all normal men are affected in the presence of physical suffering. The trick was very simple and probably very effective. It consisted of turning these instincts around and of directing them towards the self. So instead of saying, "What horrible things I did to people," the murderers would be able to say, "What horrible things I had to watch and do, and how heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders." At the same time, the human need for justice can find no satisfactory reply in considering all German people as equally guilty. Where all are considered guilty, nobody can be judged. for that guilt is not accompanied by even the mere pretense of responsibility. Guilt implies the consciousness of guilt, and punishment requires evidence that the criminal is a responsible person. It has been well described by an American correspondent in a dialogue he conducted in the Majdanek concentration camp. Question: did you kill people in the camp? Answer: yes. Question: did you bury them alive? Answer: yes. Question: did you personally help kill people? Answer: absolutely not. I was only a paymaster in the camp. Question: what did you think of what was going on? Answer: it was bad at first, but we got used to it. Question: do you know the Russians will hang you? Answer, bursting into tears: why should they? What have I done? Really, he had done nothing. He had only carried out orders. And since when has it been a crime to carry out orders? Since when has it been a virtue to rebel? Since when could one only be decent by welcoming death? What then had he done? For many years now, we have met Germans who declare they are ashamed of being Germans. I've often felt tempted to answer that I am ashamed of being human. For the idea of humanity, when purged of all sentimentality, has the very serious consequence that men must assume responsibility for all crimes committed by men, and that all nations share the onus of evil committed by all others. Shame at being a human is the purely individual and non-political expression of this insight. To follow a non-imperialistic policy and maintain a non-racist faith becomes more and more difficult, because it becomes clearer every day how great a burden mankind is for man. Hilda, my dear friend, I left Freiburg yesterday, where I went to retrieve abandoned Jewish property. If not for that purpose, would I have gone to meet Heidegger? I don't know. In any event, H looks the same, and then he went on about some tragedy in which I presumably played a role in the first 2 acts. His tone depicted guilt, but in all honesty, he has the eyes of a wretched poodle. Don't show this letter to yours. I'm basically happy for being right, never to forget. Forgiveness and revenge belong to one another. The forgiver renounces revenge because he too could have been guilty. The avenger doesn't want to forgive because he has an opportunity to get back for what was done to him. Reconciliation, however, neither forgives nor accepts, rather, it judges. When you take upon yourself as a member of human society the burden of what the other did, you don't accept the blame or absolve him from the blame. Rather, you take upon yourself the injustice that occurred in reality. It's a decision to be a partner to the accountability, not at all a partner to the guilt.
She helped create the Heidegger myth. The Heidegger myth is that he engaged in politics in 1933, realized that this is not for him, and then withdrew. That, to me, is a myth, and it's not true. We know his active support of the Nazis for long after that, okay? Where I'm critical of Hannah is that after the reunion, after she meets him, that there really isn't a kind of outspoken critique of the role that he played, you know. So in this respect, I think there was a kind of blindness and deficiency.
משפט האחרון שהגרוסה הנה אמרה לי, זה היה ביולי 75, כשהבאנו אותה במרבך לרכבת, אז על הרציף אני ידעתי שהיא נסעה אליו, אז פשוט שאלתי אותה, muss das sein? והתשובה הידועה הייתה, Fröschlein, es gibt Dinge, die sind stärker als der Mensch. יש דברים שהם יותר חזקים מהאדם, זהו.
November 25th, 1970. Heinrich died suddenly on October 31st, within 7.5 hours. The mourners' gathering was on the 4th. His ashes were buried on the 15th in Bard. One man left with what his alone, with land and a horse, patience and silence, and then the heavens and the eagles joined. 1971, without Heinrich, free as a leaf in the wind.
The loneliness, that shows at the end, after her husband died especially. She looked 160. She has become like a prophet out of the Hebrew Bible. And that face in those last photographs is just the life she led, the life. I think it all showed in her face. She was an exile, an emigre from Germany, then from France, and then in the United States, where she found she belonged. Then she wrote the Eichmann book, and then she was, so to speak, excommunicated from the Jewish communities in America, in Europe, and Israel. And then men in her life, the men in her life also betrayed her, including her deeply, deeply loved husband.
I think that part of the reason that she has enjoyed such, never mind the criticism, but such renown, is precise because she was an independent thinker, that she doesn't fit any traditional categories. She's not a classical liberal, she's not a classicist Marxist, she's not a classic conservative, you know, she's always transforming, and here's a person thinking about the most important of the issues without using these standard categories. You know.
I think there's an exilic perspective that is Jewish and not Jewish. It's Jewish for sure because she's a Jewish exile, but it gives her a certain kind of commitment. It's the basis of a commitment for all refugees. In other words, she universalizes from the position of Jewish exile. And the universalization of that perspective leads to, I think, an extremely important prioritization of the right of the refugee.
Difficult as it is to conceive evil, even in the face of its factual existence, it seems to be closely connected with the invention of a system in which all men are equally superfluous. The dangers of the corpse factories and holes of oblivion is that today, masses of people are continually rendered superfluous when we continue to think of our world in utilitarian terms, rather than in terms of a common world, shared by all. Political, social, and economic events in modern times are in a silent conspiracy with totalitarian instruments devised to make man superfluous. Totalitarian solutions may well survive the fall of totalitarian regimes in the form of a strong temptation which will come up whenever it seems impossible to alleviate political, social, or economic misery in a manner worthy of man.